Sorry, but the delivery service uses the side entrance. Those were the first words I heard when I set foot in the main lobby of Bexley and Hanro. There was no good morning, no eye contact, just that dry, automatic sentence spoken by a middle-aged white security guard in an impeccable uniform, his badge hanging so heavily it seemed to weigh more than his tone of voice. I still had my hand outstretched, holding my guest badge, the same one I'd received by email from the board's presidency, but he didn't even look. "Are you here for a pickup or maintenance?" another employee at reception asked, barely hiding his disdain. It was in that moment I realized I was not just a stranger in that building. I was an unwelcome presence, an unplanned body, a face that didn't fit their frame. If you've ever been through something like this, felt the weight of being judged before you were heard, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe to the channel, because unfortunately, this story could be yours too. My name is Leonard Hayes, and that day I wasn't there to deliver anything. I'd been summoned to lead. I walked into that glass tower with one purpose: to present a 9-figure merger proposal between two logistics giants, a game changer for thousands of people. But all of that was ignored the moment my shoes touched the marble floor of the reception. I was dressed in my finest, freshly tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, a leather portfolio filled with documents signed by lawyers and advisors. Still, I was reduced to a stereotype. The guard pointed toward the back door. Vendors enter there. Third-party staff wait in Auditorium B. It was as if my mere presence was disrupting the decor. "I'm the senior consultant responsible for the due diligence on the merger with the Marlowe Group," I said softly but firmly. "I have a meeting scheduled on the 27th floor. My name is on the board's agenda." The receptionist sighed without even checking her system. "Sir, we've received numerous resumes for operational roles. Unfortunately, you must wait to be called." The coldness of her tone was so rehearsed, it felt like corporate policy. But it wasn't ignorance, it was certainty. Someone like me could never belong at the top of that tower. Behind me, 3 men in suits laughed quietly, sharing a silent code of superiority. I sat on a bench nearby, holding on to the dignity the environment was trying to strip away. There I remained, portfolio in my lap, watching the glass elevators ascend in silence, as if reserved only for the chosen few. I knew exactly what was happening. I've lived it before, and perhaps you have too. But what nobody there knew was that I wasn't merely attending that meeting. I was about to preside over it. And when the truth came out, none of those haughty faces would walk away unscathed. Sometimes the hardest fall doesn't come from justice, it comes from the shame itself. I sat for nearly 7 minutes before any other employee addressed me. During that time, I watched at least 4 men and 2 women enter unimpeded, all white, all dressed like me, or even more casually. One wore a worn blazer and sneakers, yet none were questioned. One of them even joked with the receptionist, and she laughed. A genuine sound I had been denied. Each entry made my presence more glaring, more awkward, and I felt their stares, their whispers, their silent judgments, saying more than any spoken command ever could. It was as if I occupied a space that, for them, could only be transient and never legitimate. Shortly thereafter, a tall man with grey hair, wearing a dark suit with a blue lapel and an expression of authority, emerged from one of the elevators. He walked with firm steps, like someone not used to being interrupted. His face was angular, his jaw clenched, his brow furrowed in a perpetual blend of hurry and disapproval. When he saw me seated on the sofa, his eyes lingered an extra second, long enough to scan me. Then he looked at the guard, then at the receptionist, and muttered, "Is he being attended to?" More as a demand than a question. The receptionist replied, "He says he has a board meeting scheduled, but nothing shows up." The man approached me without extending his hand. "What exactly are you looking for, sir?" "I'm here for the integration meeting between Marlowe and Bexley and Hanro. Name's Leonard Hayes. I was personally invited by the strategic board." My words were polite, but firm. He raised an eyebrow, as if I were telling a bad joke. "External consultant?" he asked. When I confirmed, he let out a barely audible chuckle. "Consultants don't attend executive meetings. What do you have exactly? A budget to present? Operational proposals? That kind of thing is handled on the 14th floor by the technical support team." His phrasing, "that kind of thing," sounded almost like spitting, and that's when I realized he wasn't trying to confirm my identity. He was making clear who he thought I shouldn't be. That man's name was Thomas Wexler, Director of Operations, one of the company's longest-standing employees, one who'd grown up within the corporate culture and now fancied himself the guardian of its institutional standard. He didn't know, but I did, that his name appeared in 3 of the 7 anonymous reports on toxic culture submitted by employees in recent months. I knew because I compiled them, and yet here he was, treating me like trash. An intrusion. "You can come with me to the support desk. Maybe there's an issue with your schedule," he said in a commanding tone masked as help. I refused politely. "I'll wait here. My contact should be arriving soon." Wexler snorted, glanced at his watch, and muttered, "This is going to delay everything." At that moment, the same 3 men who'd laughed earlier approached. One of them, tall, red-headed, in a navy blazer with a provocative grin, loudly remarked for me to hear, "These guys think a suit means they run the show." They all laughed. Thomas didn't reproach them. Instead, he offered a half-smile and said, "Some people just don't get what belonging to this floor means." The others nodded and smirked condescendingly. It was as if my silence affirmed their belief that I was inferior. But what they didn't know was that I learned long ago not every battle deserves to be fought in front of the ignorant. Some battles require a bigger stage. I remained seated. The clock read 8:48. In exactly 12 minutes, I was supposed to be in room 27B to lead the most strategic meeting of the semester. But now I chose to wait. I wanted to see how far their arrogance would go. Then a woman hurried down the hallway, hair pulled back, wearing a burgundy blazer, clutching a tablet. She looked around, recognized me immediately, and quickened her pace. "Mr. Hayes, I'm so sorry for the delay. The room is ready for you. The board asked us to escort you straight to the presentation." A tense silence fell. Thomas slowly turned his head toward her. "He is Leonard Hayes?" he asked, as if the name had just gained real weight. The assistant confirmed, puzzled by his shock. "Yes, sir. Mr. Hayes was appointed by the Strategic Board in New York. He will lead the merger presentation." The declaration hit like a brick in the middle of the room. The security guard took a step back. The receptionist finally looked at me with wide eyes, and Thomas froze. His face drained of color, and he swallowed hard. There was no more pretending. The man they tried to expel was the most important person in that building that morning, and in that instant, arrogance became fear, and prejudice turned into embarrassment. Thomas tried to recover. "Ah, right. We were just resolving a misunderstanding. There must have been a scheduling error in the system. It happens." But his voice trembled. The apology sounded flimsy, improvised. The men behind him stopped laughing. None dared to maintain their gaze. One pretended to check his phone. The discomfort was palpable. The shame had settled in, and the silence that was once scornful now reeked of awkwardness. The assistant turned to me with a gentle smile and gestured toward the private executive elevator. I rose slowly, with the same calm I'd maintained from the start. Before leaving, I looked Thomas Wexler squarely in the eye. There was no anger, only the clarity of someone who understands the game. He averted his gaze, but not quickly enough. I saw fear settle where pride once reigned. The beat. 3 men who'd mocked me pretended to be occupied, but their slumped shoulders and downcast expressions betrayed them. We entered the elevator. The door closed slowly, as if savoring that final moment of silent humiliation. Inside, the assistant tried to keep things light. "The room is ready, Mr. Hayes. The council team is in place and the projection data has been validated. Would you like to start with the asset analysis or the integration roadmap?" I smiled faintly. "Let's start with the numbers. They always speak the loudest." And in that moment I knew my words carried more weight than she could imagine, because in that company, where so many spoke loudly based on family names or inherited titles, it would be the data and my presence that showed who truly had a voice. On the board floor, the atmosphere was completely different. Plush carpets, modern artwork on the walls, a quiet reception area with fresh coffee and sweeping views of the skyline. I was greeted by one of the international board members, Richard Belmont, a man of soft-spoken elegance, who shook my hand with genuine respect. "Hayes, we're so glad you came in person. The team is eager to hear your analysis. Robert mentioned you brought very solid proposals for tax structuring." I thanked him and entered the meeting room. Only when I saw the faces around the table did I realize all the names that truly mattered were there. None of them were the ones who tried to block me on the ground floor. The room was spacious, with panoramic windows, an oval table, and an LED screen displaying the meeting title, Project Convergence, Stage 3, Strategic Merger with Marlowe Group. Richard led me to the head of the table. "This seat is yours, Leonard. The presentation is yours. The next 90 minutes are all yours." I looked around. I saw operations directors, tax advisors, global department heads, but Thomas Wexler was not there. He hadn't been invited, and that spoke volumes. I placed my portfolio on the table, opened my laptop, connected to the system, and began arranging the slides. The room fell silent in concentration. Here, no one questioned my place. A few minutes before I began, the door burst open unexpectedly. It was Thomas, disheveled, his tie crooked, his expression a mix of surprise and panic. "Sorry to intrude," he said, looking at Richard. "I heard the consultant arrived and thought I might contribute some operational data." Richard Belmont regarded him coldly. "Thomas, this meeting is restricted to names pre-approved by the board. You're not among the validated participants. Why are you here?" Thomas hesitated. He looked at me, at the screen, then realized he'd not only lost control, he'd lost respect. I tried to maintain my composure, but it was impossible not to feel the symbolic weight of that moment. It was like watching a gear brake in front of its operator. Thomas tried to justify himself. "I believe I can offer logistical insights that complement Mr. Hayes's strategic vision." But nobody answered. Richard then said firmly, "Mr. Hayes is not merely a guest. He is the technical lead on this merger. If not for his backstage work, this company would likely be facing a hostile takeover." The silence that followed hit everyone like a gut punch. Thomas stammered, I didn't know." His words faltered. He looked at me with a hint of regret, or perhaps fear. "If I'd known who you were, I would have—" He trailed off. I finished for him, calmly. "Treated me with respect." The weight of my words hung in the air. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with dignity, Thomas. But now you do." Richard intervened again. "Please escort Mr. Wexler back to the ground floor." 2 security guards discreetly stepped forward to remove him. As he left the room, I saw how his hands trembled. He said nothing more, no apology, no denial, because he knew. He knew that in that instant, there was no room for flimsy excuses. He'd been exposed, not by me, but by his own actions. And that, more than any firing, was the real punishment, being unmasked before those who once applauded him. The room still absorbed the silence left by Thomas's departure when the door opened again, this time with a quiet authority that was palpable. Clara Whitmore, chair of the Hanro Capital Holdings Investment Board, strode in. Her light grey blazer, perfectly coiffed hair, and black leather portfolio made her the most imposing figure on the floor. It was rare for Clara to appear in person. She usually attended by proxy or video conference, yet there she was, live, with attentive eyes and silent steps. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, nodding at me. I stood immediately. "On the contrary," I replied, "your presence is most welcome." Heads turned. Clara walked to the front of the room beside me and addressed everyone. "Many of you may not be aware, but it's important that you all know. Mr. Leonard Hayes is not only leading the integration with Marlowe Group, he has been officially appointed by unanimous vote of our committee as interim CEO of the Strategy and Asset Restructuring Division. His role will not only be to oversee the merger, but to evaluate the behavior and culture of this company's leadership." The impact of those words was immediate. Stunned silence. Every glance that had previously carried judgment now sought neutrality. Some hid discomfort behind bureaucratic smiles, others simply looked away. But I saw it all. I felt it. That shift wasn't about titles or administration. It was symbolic. It was the inversion of a system built on appearances and exclusion. Clara continued, "Leonard has spent the past weeks conducting internal audits, reviewing processes, and listening to employees from all levels. The board is extremely pleased with his professionalism, ethics, and vision for restoring this organization's credibility." She then opened her portfolio, retrieved a document stamped with the Hanro Capital Holdings seal, and placed it on the table. "This is the official memorandum granting him full authority to review, suspend, and recommend structural changes in any area of the company, even within this committee." When she finished speaking, One of the department heads whispered, "He stands above us all." As if cued, the screen updated with a new slide in my presentation, now titled Ethical and Functional Restructuring Plan. Phase 1. Organizational Culture and Leadership. The room that had once been dominated by ego now recoiled. The discomfort was almost tangible. And for me, it wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, about bringing to light what had long been hidden behind titles, surnames, and condescending glances. It was about proving that competence and character know no color, and that true power doesn't need to shout, it asserts itself by example. Richard Belmont broke the silence. "I believe we're all ready to hear the plan, Mr. Hayes." I took a deep breath, stood, pressed the remote, and the screen displayed the consolidated audit data. But before diving in, I spoke clearly. Before the numbers, I want to share what I've observed in recent days, because graphs explain what's happening, but only truth explains why. The silence was absolute, and I began, not for myself, but for all those who, like me, had been silenced for years in environments like this. I outlined with firm clarity the patterns I'd identified, the disdain with which receptionists treated candidates with non-European surnames, the silent promotions among country club members, the corridor jokes, the emails laced with language mistakes, the pats on the back reserved only for insiders. I saw faces redden, others turn pale, but I pressed on. This company doesn't just need a merger of assets. It needs a merger of respect and responsibility. When I finished, Clara nodded. "Well put. Now let's move on to practical measures." As Clara distributed documents, a new name appeared on the screen. Conduct Report. Operations. It was an excerpt from the internal audit detailing anonymous complaints over the past 4 months, complete with data, testimonials, email screenshots, audio clips, and internal videos. And among the names cited was Thomas Wexler, the same man who, less than half an hour earlier, tried to bar me from entering the building because my face didn't fit. Clara didn't hesitate. "In light of this evidence, Mr. Wexler is hereby suspended from all duties pending the outcome of the ethical and disciplinary review." The room fell into stunned silence, silent but not without impact. I saw colleagues exchange furtive glances. Some fiddled with their tablets, others dropped their eyes. Thomas's suspension wasn't merely punishment, it was a warning, a mirror held up to a silent impunity that had long masked abusive behavior under the guise of tradition. Thomas, once an unquestioned pillar of the company's culture, was now emblematic of everything that had to change. The shame on his face at the announcement was more crushing than any shouted dismissal. The scene grew even more symbolic when the compliance director, a reserved man with round glasses, approached him with a blue folder. "Mr. Thomas Wexler, per protocol, your badge will be deactivated today. Please return all company devices and await the Conduct Committee's formal review." Thomas's hand shook as he signed the receipt. For the first time, he looked small, not because of the position he was losing, but because the power he thought he had was never real. It was just the reflection of a crumbling system. He glanced at me, as if seeking compassion or mercy or a loophole for justification. But I held his gaze, not to humiliate him, but so he could face himself. That moment marked the true start of justice, not vengeance but exposure. And as he was led out, a profound realization seemed to spread through the room. This was a new direction, one where tolerance of abuse would no longer stand. Shortly thereafter, Clara reclaimed the floor to reinforce the rebuilding plan. From now on, behavior will be a criterion. Promotion will no longer be an automatic privilege, but real recognition of attitude and conduct. The new directives included mandatory internal assessments, a protected whistleblower hotline, compulsory training, and restructuring of HR processes. "We're not here to punish, we're here to transform," she said, and I believed her, because that morning I witnessed something few get to see, the exact moment a toxic system began to crack. Even so, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Rules alone don't change minds. Changing minds happens when individuals confront the silent, everyday biases, those muffled jokes, those sideways glances, those opportunities denied before they're even requested. True transformation isn't achieved through memoranda or compliance charts. It happens in the conscience, when someone dares to look in the mirror. And that morning, the first reflection had been shown. After detailing the new guidelines, Clara handed the floor back to me. There was an expectation that I'd demand more, firing people, pointing fingers, turning the room into a tribunal, but that was never my goal. I stood calmly, took a breath and looked each person in the eye. I am not here to take justice into my own hands, I began. I'm here to propose something harder, real change. It starts with discomfort, but it must evolve into transformation. Respectful silence followed, different from the defensive hush earlier. It was the silence of those finally listening. Thomas Wexler was not solely responsible for this company's toxic culture. He may have been the most visible face, but the structure that sustained him was built on complicit glances, unchallenged jokes and unexplained rejections. That is a collective responsibility. I saw one director bow her head, another executive adjust his tie. So instead of just eliminating, I propose reconstruction, an internal re-education program with cross-mentoring, active listening, and continuous ethical evaluation. I want our future leaders to listen before judging, to acknowledge before ignoring, to include before excluding. Some looked relieved, others challenged, but all understood this wasn't about revenge. It was about shifting a paradigm. This program will be mandatory for leadership and optional for others. Results from these learning cycles will factor into promotions and bonuses. Clara nodded at my side. We will engage an independent consultancy to ensure this is more than a symbolic gesture. There will be metrics, anonymous surveys, and real accountability. And in that moment, I realized we weren't just discussing the future. We were rewriting the foundation of a new one. One name remained, someone absent from the room, but whose presence still cast a shadow: Thomas. When I mentioned his suspension, some expected he'd be permanently banished. But I said what few dared. Thomas will have the opportunity to join the program, not as a privilege, but as a principle, because this plan's aim is not to erase the past, but to build a future where people like him learn, confront their own biases, and act differently. Murmurs ran through the room, but no one objected. Then Clara, with her usual composure, said something that struck me deeply. Giving someone a chance to change is a risk, but denying that chance perpetuates the cycle. Silence fell for the first time that morning, not out of awkwardness, but out of genuine reflection. I sensed admiration from some colleagues, not because I asserted power, but because I offered bridges instead of walls. And in that gesture, something shifted, not just in words, but on the faces around the table. I concluded the meeting by emphasizing that re-education would not be easy. There would be resistance and discomfort. But that was preferable to repeating the same cycle that pushes talent out and protects privilege under the guise of tradition. The company that survives the coming years is the one that knows how to evolve, not just to profit. Clara smiled gently. And that will be our new competitive edge: character. As we left, one of the company's longest-serving directors approached me, eyes glistening. "I was silent for too long," she whispered. "I witnessed so much and said nothing out of fear or convenience. But today, for the first time, I felt someone spoke for me too." Her words moved me deeply, because it wasn't just about those who spoke, it was about those who silently suffered. Thomas spent the next 3 days holed up at home. To many, it seemed like a mere pause, but internally, he was undergoing a collapse he couldn't yet name. He ignored calls and emails, and for the first time in over 20 years, he woke without wearing a tie. His reflection in the mirror looked different, not by appearance, but by the way he avoided eye contact. The silence of his home, once a symbol of power, now felt like a constant accusation. On his living room shelf, trophies and certificates no longer felt like accolades. They were reminders of a life built on shaky ground. That week, he received an official email from compliance outlining the terms of the re-education program. It was clear his reintegration depended on completing every step. The curriculum included unconscious bias training, active listening workshops, real testimonies from corporate discrimination victims, and participation in listening circles with frontline staff. Thomas read it all in silence, then closed his laptop and stared into space for long minutes. Part of him found it humiliating. Another part knew it was necessary. For the first time, he felt the system he defended was forcing him to confront himself. The following Monday, Thomas arrived 20 minutes early for his first session, just as he had when he once controlled meetings. But now, he led nothing. He sat among the participants. His name was announced simply, Thomas Wexler, Operations Department. The room was modest, chairs in a circle, a whiteboard behind, and a facilitator with a calm, firm voice. The first exercise was listening to discrimination stories from within the company. A maintenance worker shared how he never dared take the executive elevator, despite having permission, always being stopped by someone. Thomas's eyes stung. Though the man didn't name names, he knew he'd been one of those someones. That first week, Thomas spoke little. He observed, he listened, and often he avoided eye contact. When the HR manager spoke of fearing to report certain behaviors for fear of reprisal, he clenched his pen until his fingers whitened. It was her story, but it was him realizing his own. On day 4, someone said, "Sometimes the problem isn't the shout, it's the silence of those who could have acted but didn't." Thomas bowed his head. For the first time, he didn't argue or defend, because something inside him was crumbling. On Friday, the facilitator asked everyone to write 3 honest actions of theirs that might have caused someone pain. Thomas stared at the blank page for nearly half an hour, his mind wandering through corridors of meetings and unkind words, uttered too quickly or weighed too heavily. He wrote the 3 sentences, tore up the paper, and rewrote them, not out of shame, but because the words finally made sense. The pain he saw in others now had form within him. At the end of that session, a long-time janitor approached him, an older man with grey hair and calloused hands. "You don't know me," he said, "but you've kicked me out of the executive elevator 3 times. Thomas's heart clenched. He opened his mouth, but no words emerged. The man, however, wasn't angry, just tired. "I just wanted to say that today was the first time I saw you quiet, and that, for me, is a start." Then he turned and left the circle. Thomas remained standing, tear-brimmed eyes fixed on nothing. For perhaps the first time in years, he was truly present. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his living room, leafing through old reports and seeing names he now recognized as people, not mere components of a system. He thought of Leonard, how he'd treated me, how he'd tried to eject me from the building as if he were guarding something. That, as he now knew, never belonged to him. In the pre-dawn quiet, he composed an email, not to the board or compliance, but to Leonard Hayes. The subject line was simple, "If you allow." The email arrived in my inbox around 3:27 a.m. The subject caught my eye. I opened it slowly, bleary-eyed from the week's fatigue. The message was brief but profound. "Leonard, I know I don't deserve your attention, but if you allow me, I'd like to talk. Not to defend myself or clear my reputation, but to acknowledge. I need to understand what I did wrong, and perhaps only you can help me see it as a man, not a title." I read it twice, then again. What surprised me most wasn't the apology. It was that he didn't ask forgiveness. He asked for guidance. I waited 2 days before replying. I wanted to ensure my response wasn't impulsive. When I finally wrote back, I got straight to the point. "Thomas, if you truly want to understand, this won't be a meeting. It will be a process. I'm neither your therapist nor your judge, but I can be a witness, someone who shows you what you've refused to see. If you're willing to listen without interrupting, we can begin." I scheduled a time for the following Monday in a small ground-floor conference room, the same floor where he'd tried to keep me out. It felt symbolic and necessary. On the scheduled day, Thomas arrived punctually, sans tie, his jacket more relaxed, shoulders a bit lower. He greeted me with a hesitant nod, without extending his hand, perhaps out of respect, perhaps shame. I simply pointed to the chair opposite me. "Please sit." He obeyed silently. The first words out of his mouth stunned me. "I thought the problem was the system. Today I realize I was the system." His sentence hung in the air for a few seconds. I didn't respond immediately. I studied him, trying to discern truth from performance. But his eyes, they were different, weighted, painful. "Do you know how many people quit after meetings with you?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, then admitted, "No." I showed him a graph, a silent curve of attrition that matched his assent. He stared at the data as if it hurt more than any rebuke. "It wasn't just with me, Thomas. Years of building an invisible wall, and many accepted it as normal. He nodded slowly, eyes reddened. I was praised for it, he whispered. I got bonuses, commendations, promotions. No one told me it was wrong. Of course not, I replied, because the culture you helped sustain rewarded silence, not integrity. He sat motionless, breathing heavier, hands clasped on the table. Then, voice trembling, he said, I don't know if I can forgive myself. It wasn't self-pity. It was genuine admission. I offered no comfort, merely responded, then start by listening to others. Only then might you hear yourself. Our conversation lasted over an hour, quiet but transformative. We emerged changed, not reconciled, but willing. And at that stage, willingness was everything. In the following days, Thomas remained publicly silent, but was fully engaged in the process. He attended every session, read every piece of material, and, for the first time, asked questions instead of offering answers. In the cafeteria, he sat with staff he'd once ignored. In the corridors, he nodded respectfully, not the automatic condescension of old, but genuine humility. And day by day, small signs of change appeared. Nothing grand or forced, just subtle shifts suggesting something inside him had truly changed. Over the weeks, noticeable transformations took shape at Bexley and Hanrow. The tense environment, marked by exclusionary rituals like deciding who rode the main. Elevator, who got invited to which meetings, began to soften. It wasn't uniform or immediate, but it was evident. The IT team, for instance, was consulted from a project's inception, not just when something broke. Previously invisible employees had their names mentioned in meetings, and corridor glances were no longer filtered by title or appearance. In HR, a new active listening policy was rolled out. Every microaggression complaint was logged anonymously and, crucially, enforced. The first-month report showed a 37% drop in voluntary resignations and a 52% uptick in unsolicited positive feedback in organizational climate surveys. This was not mere management, it was repair, the building of a culture where people finally felt they belonged. Thomas, meanwhile, stayed out of leadership for 2 more months, and astonishingly, he didn't object. During that time, he volunteered for a reverse mentoring program, listening to frontline stories rather than giving directives. It was uncomfortable at first, especially when a young black trainee in accounting said, "I almost turned down this job when I heard you still worked here." Thomas replied, "You'd have been right to do so, but I hope you now see a different path forming." The trainee nodded, expression neutral, but he stayed. That alone was progress. One of the program's toughest exercises asked participants to reenact real discrimination scenarios from the company. An actor played a guard blocking a black employee at the main entrance. When asked who'd experienced that, 2 people raised their hands. One was Thomas. "Not personally," he clarified, "but I caused it, and I'm here so that scene never repeats, here or anywhere." His voice trembled and no one laughed. In that moment he spoke not as a director but as a human being. My meetings with Thomas continued, not often, but deeply. They were short yet intense, with reflections, questions, and sometimes silence. I never made it easy. "Don't expect medals for doing what you should have done from the start," I told him. But I never blocked his progress either. Gradually, a new layer of respect took root, not enforced by titles, but born from the authenticity of effort. Thomas's transformation began to ripple outward. Other leaders, once defensive or indifferent, joined the program. Some out of fear, some out of duty, many out of genuine impact. What started as a course correction became a reconstruction. There were no ready-made formulas, only commitment. And in the lobby, where Leonard Hayes' presence was once deemed a system error, it was now my integrity that set the standard. Elevators still rose, but their doors no longer closed so quickly. Every step toward inclusion was also a step toward restoring the dignity so long denied. From her vantage point, Clara Whitmore observed discreetly but never distantly. "The biggest change," she once told me, "wasn't in the system. It was in the people powering it. And you can't achieve that with authority, only with truth." I said nothing, gazing out the 27th floor window at the diverse group entering through the front doors below, unquestioned, unjudged, unapologetically present. Was it enough? Perhaps not. But that morning it felt like the start of a new chapter. The auditorium was packed for the first internal event, dedicated solely to the new organizational culture policy. Named Recognize, Repair, Rebuild, it had seating for 200, but drew twice as many. The broadcast went to all branches with simultaneous translation in 3 languages. For the first time in years, the focus wasn't on financial targets or new deals. It was about people, stories, and mistakes, once dismissed as noise, but in truth were muffled cries. At the end of the program, after employee testimonials, diversity panels, and a keynote by Clara Whitmore and board members, I was invited on stage. I wasn't the formal star of the event, but everyone knew this transformation began with me. My speech was brief and direct. Leadership isn't being right, it's doing what's right. And today I stand here not for reacting to what was done to me, but for choosing not to repeat it. If this company has a future, it's because at last we started listening. Applause broke out but paused when I announced the next speaker. I now invite Thomas Wexler to share some words. The silence that followed was immediate and deep. A few whispered. Eyebrows rose. Then Thomas stepped onto the stage, not as the man who once intimidated with a glance, but as someone bearing the weight of who he'd been and who he aspired to be. He'd shed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and carried a simple notebook. Center stage. He paused, inhaled, and began. My name is Thomas Wexler. For years I was considered a model leader here, but today, with all I've learned, I can say I wasn't a leader. I was a distorted reflection of power, a product of a system that rewarded silence and punished difference, and I benefited from it. His voice was steady but softer than before, not authoritative but humble. I'm not here to ask forgiveness. That would be too easy. I'm here to acknowledge, because without acknowledgement, there is no repair, and without repair, there is no future. The camera captured faces in the audience, some with tears, others nodding solemnly. Above all, there was listening, true listening. Thomas continued. When I was suspended, I thought I'd lost everything, but I realized I'd only begun to find what I'd lost long ago, the ability to see the other, to see myself in the other. He turned to me. And Leonard, I can never know how often I hurt you with words, gestures, or silence, but I do know what you taught me. Dignity isn't demanded, it's demonstrated, and you showed that without raising your voice or losing control. Thank you for not returning hate with hate. I said nothing, just inclined my head. That was enough, because that moment wasn't about me. It was about Thomas and everyone else who needed to see that change is possible, but requires truth. The auditorium remained still for several seconds, then applause erupted. Measured, mature, a recognition unlike any before. After the event, dozens approached me with words of encouragement, but one line from an intern waiting in the coffee line stayed with me. I almost quit on my first month, but today was the first time I saw myself staying. I smiled. Then the change has begun. She smiled back, and in that instant, I realized reports and speeches and charts matter less than that. One single person deciding to stay, that is the most powerful change of all. 2 months later, a video began circulating quietly among employees. A shaky phone recording from a public school in the city's South Zone. There he was, Thomas Wexler, in a classroom of 20 teenagers, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, speaking simply and calmly. The corporate world may seem like an untouchable castle, he said, but it's not invincible. And more importantly, it needs you, it needs change, and change starts where you are. The video wasn't official, it wasn't a LinkedIn post or a viral clip, but it generated something far more valuable: respect. From then on, Thomas regularly visited technical schools, community centers, and youth programs, not to lecture but to listen. He shared his mistakes as lessons and showed that acknowledgement can be a new beginning. Some still doubted, but many listened, because he no longer spoke as a 27th floor executive. He spoke as someone who'd once been lost in the system and chose to remake it from within. In one visit, a young student asked, "Did you do this out of guilt?" Thomas replied, "No, I act from conscience. Guilt drags you down. Conscience moves you forward." Meanwhile, at Bexley and Hanrow, I continued my work with my usual low profile, firm, coherent, consistent. I declined interviews and avoided the spotlight. My name was spoken with respect, but I still ate lunch in the same cafeteria and joined meetings with interns. I was that rare leader who didn't need to assert power to be followed. Once, when offered a public honor by the group's presidency, I politely refused. My tribute is seeing people walk through the front door unimpeded. That's enough for me. Then something unexpected happened. One of the oldest guards approached me, a reserved man who spoke slowly. He admitted he'd witnessed prejudice for years but never intervened. I regret that, he confessed. But if it's not too late, I'd like to join the reverse mentoring program. I smiled. It's never too late to start seeing. That quiet conversation, away from grand stages, meant more than many high-budget projects, because that's what mattered, creating a culture where even those who'd been complicit felt safe to begin anew, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire for truth. Internal reports soon showed a significant drop in turnover and a 28% increase in leadership diversity within 6 months. Listening programs expanded internationally, but the most astonishing metric came from anonymous surveys. Over 70% of employees said for the first time they felt seen, not managed, but seen. In a corporate world where so many become mere numbers, that was a silent revolution. As Clara once observed, perhaps this was the only merger that truly mattered, the merger of power and empathy. I heard those words and merely smiled. I knew the work wasn't done. There were still pockets of resistance, small circles clinging to old attitudes, but I also knew that's part of the process. Deconstruction isn't a single act, it's a journey, and I was committed to walking it quietly, without fanfare, because true leadership transforms without requiring applause, and I'd learned that from that first day of humiliation in the lobby. No position ranks higher than a clear conscience. One Saturday afternoon, Thomas and I met again at a community center for a social entrepreneurship workshop. I was there as a guest, but mostly to listen. When I arrived, I spotted him at the back, wearing jeans and a navy sweater, looking at ease, no longer out of place, but at peace. He saw me, waved, and after the session ended, joined me. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said. I smiled briefly. "I thought you wouldn't last 2 weeks." He laughed, at himself, not at me. It was the most honest laugh I'd ever heard from him. We walked together to a weathered wooden bench under a tree. We didn't talk about positions or reports or the company. We talked about people, about children, about painful choices. At one point, Thomas fell silent, then handed me a small folded piece of paper. It was the copy of his pre-dawn email. "I keep this to remember who I was when I decided to change," he said. "Not because I'm proud of that man, but because I must never become him again." We sat quietly for a while, the distant laughter of children, faint music, the smell of popcorn in the breeze. Finally, he looked at me and asked, "Do you forgive me?" I inhaled deeply. My answer didn't come right away. I gazed ahead at that scene, unexecutive but profoundly real, and said, "I no longer carry what you did to me. So, in a way, yes, but forgiveness isn't a seal of absolution. It's a door. What you do upon crossing it is your choice." He nodded. "Crossing is the hardest part," he whispered, "but it's also where freedom begins." In that moment, I knew he understood. We parted with a firm handshake. No speeches, no formality. Just two men, each having traveled different paths to arrive at the same point, a genuine desire to make things right. As I walked to my car, I saw him helping stack chairs with other volunteers. None of them knew who he'd been. And that was good, because there he no longer needed a title to be valuable, just to be present. And in that moment, Thomas Wexler was exactly that. Presence itself. Not arrogance, not authority, just someone willing to start over. Back in my routine, the days passed with my usual discipline, but I noticed something new in how I viewed the company's corridors, my emails, the faces I saw. Maybe it was knowing people were now listening. Maybe it was no longer expecting recognition, or maybe simply understanding that the greatest revolution starts not in grand halls but in small acts, choosing kindness after being ignored, offering a hand when you could walk away, remaining integral when everything else invites surrender. Time moved on, and the ripples of what we'd lived began to spread quietly, like seeds on the wind. Some sprouted quickly, others took time, but all were there, transforming the soil of a culture that had been too harsh to bloom. And now, with care, listening, and truth, it began to flower. Imperfectly but promisingly, and perhaps that was enough. Weeks later, I received an unexpected message from a young intern at headquarters, simple, yet profound. "Mr. Hayes, I doubt you remember me. I was the girl crying in the cafeteria, the day Thomas was suspended. I just wanted to say I'm still here. I was promoted to analyst. Every time I think of quitting, I remember your calm that day, how you showed it's worth staying." I read it 3 times, then set my phone aside and allowed myself something rare, to close my eyes for a few seconds and simply feel. Because sometimes the most powerful change you can spark is making someone believe they deserve to be here. Thomas's story became an example, not a fairy tale, nor a perfect narrative, but an uncomfortable mirror showing we all can err, and we can also change. He wasn't rewarded. He didn't return to his old post, and he didn't want to. He took on a new role as Director of Social Impact, focusing on educational programs and professional inclusion. He never led by fear again. He began guiding by listening, and each group of new hires, he personally joined orientation to share his story, not as a trophy, but as a living warning. Power without conscience builds walls. Humility with purpose builds bridges. Years passed. Faces changed, challenges evolved, but the essence remained. And whenever someone new walks through the front doors, unbarred, unjudged, unwelcome no more, I remember that first day. The day I was discredited, kept out, silenced, but chose to stand firm, because sometimes standing firm is the most powerful act of all. Not to defeat another, but to defeat what drags us into cynicism, into anger, into silence. Once, during a leadership keynote, I was asked to define justice. I paused and replied, "Justice is when you have all the power to humiliate someone, but choose instead to educate." Some in the audience applauded. Others fell silent in contemplation. That's what moved me most, planting doubt where only certainty once thrived, especially when that certainty upheld prejudice. If this story touched you, if you've ever been discredited, underestimated, or judged before being heard, know this: you are not alone. More than that, you are not wrong. The fault lies with those who limit you because they fear your light, those who mistake your silence for submission, when, in truth, it's your wisdom speaking. Don't give up on being whole in a world that insists on halves, because the world changes when someone endures with dignity. Before I close, I ask one thing. If this story stirred something in you, a discomfort, a memory, a desire to change, share it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching or listening from. And if you can, subscribe to the channel. Not to follow me, but so we can keep building this space where real stories become beacons for those still in the dark. Because sometimes all someone needs is to know they're not alone. This was Leonard Hayes' story. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Perhaps your story is just beginning now.